Okay, now we start. All right. Chapter 16. Oh, here it is. Your book opens up with a vignette like the other ones do. This one is about a man who I promise you will not be on a test, but James Rapier. He is important, though, and he's one of the men who served in the capacity of a government official after the Civil War. He was a black man. He fled to Canada, and then when the Union won the Civil War, he thought, this is great, now things are going to go my way. Went south and found that things are more dangerous for blacks than ever. And, but he served for a while in a government office. He was eventually forced to keep himself quiet. All right. Now, the main body of chapter 15. Abraham Lincoln, as the war was ending, he made a speech, a famous speech. We're going to bind up the nation's wounds, take care of his widow and his orphan, basically for both sides. And he said, with malice toward none, with charity for all. Very famous words. When Lincoln died suddenly, Andrew Johnson took over, and he when he took over, Johnson, April of 1865, Congress was not in session. Now keep in mind they had the railroad, but travel was still slower than it is today. They did not have the airplane. So Congress in session. The Constitution did not spell out just who was to restore the Union after the Union divided. Nowhere, and nobody knew, and to this day we really don't know. I mean, who fixes the Union? Johnson said the President does. Congress said that they do. The problem was Johnson was in the White House serving as President. The Congress was scattered all over the country and they did not assemble. Johnson made a whole lot of moves that were very conciliatory toward the South. When the Congress finally convened months later, they wanted to undo what Johnson had done because they said that Johnson was too soft on the South, and this was to lead to a big constitutional crisis of sorts. Now, another thing that hurt Andrew Johnson, he had been governor of Tennessee, not that that hurt him, but in the Southern politics, he could get away with some crude, coarse, harsh speech, the type of speech that a politician should not use. And basically, he was his own worst enemy. Now, I've been criticized, I'm going to jump to the present. Our present president has sometimes done the same thing, said some things he should have. I think that our present president is getting control of his tongue now a little bit, and controlling tongue better, because he was making some shocking statements that was really hurting him for a time. Well, Johnson did the same thing, that President Andrew Johnson. The period of time we're talking about in this chapter is called the Reconstruction period, for the obvious reason that what they were trying to do, they were going to rebuild or reconstruct the Union, put it back together again. Two issues had been decided by the Civil War. Issue number one, there would be no more slavery. Slavery was outlawed. And issue number two, states did not have the right to nullify laws passed by Congress. Nullification or secession. States did not have the right to leave the Union. So the issues of secession, nullification, and slavery, those issues were settled. But there were still other issues that would need to be settled, and some of them were not to be settled for another 100 years. All right, which brings us up to 3 amendments that were passed. Now, these amendments were not passed, all of them, after the Civil War. Amendment number 13 was passed while the Civil War was still going on. Abraham Lincoln worked hard to push it. The 13th Amendment, it freed the slaves. Well, I'm rushing through all these quickly. Amendment 13 freed the slaves. Amendment 14 made them citizens. Amendment 15 gave them a right to vote. At least that's the wording. Now, we're going to find out that particularly that last one, the right to vote, has to be said tongue-in-cheek because it was to be 100 years before most African Americans got the right to vote. Now, the 13th Amendment, Abraham Lincoln pushed for it and got it through before he died. Now, I want you to keep in mind, folks, Abraham Lincoln in his campaign for president had promised, I will not in any way tamper with slavery where it already exists, but I will work to keep it from expanding outside of where it now exists. He felt like he had to break that promise. And I can tell you really painfully, there have been times in my life when I made a promise and then conditions changed, I had to break it. Coaching a ball team, make a promise to a player, then something happened that I didn't expect. And in the case of Abraham Lincoln, he had to break that promise because as the war progressed, more and more it became a slave war, and he saw that he had to promise to free the slaves in order to get volunteers for his army and in order to keep England and France off his back. England, they had Canada. They sent an army into Canada. France took over Mexico, and they had an army in Mexico. Lincoln knew the Union could not fight them both. So, to get the France and England off his back, he said, this is a slave war. We're fighting to free the slaves. He had to. And England and France said to Mr. Jefferson Davis, we're sorry we can't help you. Our people will not support a war where you're fighting to keep slavery going, as opposed to the other side. So England and France, again, you understand, folk, he knew he made the promise. We all know him, but sometimes, try as you might, conditions change to where you simply cannot do what you said you're going to do. Anyway, Abraham Lincoln pushed for the 13th Amendment. Now, the other thing, the 13th Amendment was passed and approved. All right, here's the rules. An amendment has to be passed by 2/3 of both houses. House has to pass by 2/3, Senate by 2/3, and then 3/4 of the states. All right, here's the catch-22. The states that left the Union did not get to vote on it. Georgia had no representatives in Congress, neither did South Carolina. Georgia had no senators, neither did South Carolina. They had nobody representing Congress, so the vote was taken without them. As for the 3/4 of the states, that did not include states like Georgia and Florida and South Carolina and Alabama, Mississippi, and Tennessee. They had left the Union. So the 3/4 of the states that voted for it were the 3/4 of states who were still in the Union. And all their representative senators, not all, but most of their representative senators voted for it. This made the war a slave war. So the 13th Amendment, the Confederate States sent their vice president and a couple of other high Confederate officials to try to talk to Mr. Lincoln and reason with him and say, listen, you don't understand, we have to have slavery. Lincoln would not talk to them. And again, he sent them home without talking, except to send a message, this war is a war to end slavery, which it had become. But again, he got more volunteers into his army by doing that. Not to mention that he got England and France off, Great Britain and France off his back. So anyway, the 13th Amendment was passed while Abraham Lincoln was still alive. Well, it turned out that the 13th Amendment was not quite enough. So, well, would the freed slaves become citizens? The 14th Amendment said they would, but the problem was the 14th Amendment was approved by the House and Senate after the war was over. After Lincoln had died. Probably not after the war was over, true, and after Lincoln died. So President Johnson and the Congress both told the southern states that in order to get back into the Union, you have to ratify the 14th Amendment. Here was the catch-22. In the South, only those persons who had not borne arms against the United States were allowed to vote or hold office. So that's how that these states had left the Union. But in fact, in a lot of cases, it was black men who were now voting and holding office in the southern states, as well as the few white men who had not taken up arms. But nevertheless, the persons who had the power to vote in the South agreed, so they forced the southern states back into the Union because a lot of them, men like Robert Lee and Jefferson Davis and other southern soldiers, did not get to vote. Again, it's the rules of the game, folk. I mean, that's the way life is sometimes. If they had been everybody in the South been allowed to vote, the 14th Amendment would not have been ratified. But in order to get back in, you have to understand the 13th Amendment is already in the Constitution, and you had no say-so in it. You have to take care of the 14th Amendment in order to get in. The 15th Amendment was something that came up later. As some people know, hey, the 15th Amendment, the 14th Amendment does not say that they have the right to vote, so it's felt necessary to pass a new amendment to give former slaves the right to vote. Now, here is what happened. The women, particularly Susan Cady Stanton, felt like that the 15th Amendment should include that women should be allowed to vote also. When the 15th Amendment passed, that clause was not in. What the 15th Amendment says that people shall not be denied the right to vote because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That meant former slaves. If you were a former slave, you were supposed to have the right to vote. Now, folk, here's the sinister part of the story. The 15th Amendment, by the way, was passed. The women didn't like it. It did not include, they wanted it to read on, nobody should be denied the right to vote on account of race, previous condition of servitude, or sex. That was to come many, many years later. So women did not get the right to vote. Here's the thing that happened, though. Some black states passed a couple of laws that restricted voting. One law was that you had to pass the literacy test in order to be able to vote. Another law was you had to pay a tax at the poll in order to vote, the poll tax. These laws were designed to keep certain people from voting. Now, anybody know, in the other class at least one person did, how could you pass the literacy test? What did it take to pass the literacy test? Any of you know?
Write your name.
What's that?
Write your name. Write your name.
No, it wasn't write your name. It was something else, very sinister. You had to what?
Read a Chinese newspaper.
You're close. Okay. If you were black, the test was often given to you in Chinese. You had to have a white skin in order to pass the literacy test. There was one instance in the South where an illiterate white man couldn't even read his own name, took the test and passed it. And a black man with a PhD failed it. This actually happened. But when they did, someone said they had to be able to read Chinese. They gave a black, well, I mean, the white man never got the test in Chinese, but they gave a black man a test one time. It was in Chinese. He said, yeah, I know what it says. Well, really, what's it say? He says, there won't be very many blacks voting on election day. We can laugh about it now, folks. Now, again, some of you might have heard this now that I'm bringing it up, but this actually occurred. And what's more, now here's where the Supreme Court came in. The Supreme Court ruled that these laws were legal. The poll tax. A lot of your black people had no money at all and could not afford to pay the poll tax. The poll tax kept the blacks voting, and also in a lot of cases even kept poor whites from voting. To guarantee that only the more well-to-do whites could vote. But what if a black man could pay the tax? He was likely to be given a literacy test, which he had no chance at all of passing. Again, to pass the literacy test, you had to have a white skin. Now this literacy test was still going on, folk, when I was a child, in the 1950s and 1960s. And it kept a lot of blacks. In fact, as recently as 1964, a lot of blacks in the South still could not vote. But by 1968, a lot of that had changed. The Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964. The federal government moved in with its police and its army and forced southern states to allow blacks to vote. But then what really made a lot of southern politicians change their minds. A lot of northern people moved south, among them myself. And we changed, we voted to, once we lived long in the South long enough, and we convinced the southern politicians they had better change their ways. So, excuse me. A lot of southern politicians then realized that in order to win elections, in order to get anywhere, they had to, basically they had to lighten up on the black folk. And racist people like Governor Wallace wound up courting the black vote, letting the blacks into the polling areas, and so did some of the others. There's one man I can't think of right now, but essentially it all changed. But it took 100 years. It is known that generally it takes 100 years to change some people. I mean, children, grandchildren, but the great-grandchildren oftentimes are not as gung-ho as their great-grandparents were. All right, 3 amendments that were passed, but not necessarily one right after the other. Now, while campaigning, General Sherman, after he destroyed Atlanta, after he'd gone through South Carolina and gone through Georgia first, and when he was in North Carolina, the war was about to end, And he promised the black people 40 acres and a mule. Again, a promise that was not kept. The problem was General Sherman did not have the authority to carry that out. Now, if Lincoln had lived, but Lincoln didn't live. We do not know if Lincoln would have given every black 40 acres and a mule or not. What actually happened was Lincoln died, and Andrew Johnson took office, and Andrew Johnson did not give the blacks 40 acres and a mule. Instead, well, to make a long story short, the blacks were not given anything. What would it, well, again, this was a disappointment. 40 acres and a mule, the blacks thought we can start with this. The black people at first began to flaunt their newfound freedom, but then they realized, hey, in order for us to eat, we have to work. So some of them got to work. They worked as sharecroppers. A lot of them, though, found jobs as paid servants back on the master's plantation, working for old master like they had done before, except this time it's free laborers. You know, they were free to go. But they pretty soon learned how to work out a sharecropper. A sharecropper is where a bunch of people get together and they all farm the same field, large field usually, and then at the end of the season, they harvest the field, and then they divide up the profits among themselves. Sharecropping is borderline socialism, and it guarantees that nobody will get wealthy that way. Nevertheless, with all respect to the people who lived back then who did it, it was probably the only option they had, the only thing they could do. Black codes, laws that tried to keep ex-slaves from bettering themselves. Now, there was a Civil Rights Act, I mentioned the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which was another one passed in 1866, where the Congress tried to force the southern states into letting the blacks vote, letting the blacks serve on juries, letting the blacks hold office, making the blacks more equal. The southern people just became more firm in their resistance to it, with the result that by the time it was over with, the blacks found themselves in the worst condition they had at the beginning of Reconstruction. An organization came on the scene called the Ku Klux Klan. Now, the Ku Klux Klan was determined to keep the blacks in their place, to make sure that the blacks were intimidated from voting. A lot of blacks were scared out of voting. The Klans would show up in their hoods and burn their crosses. As a lot of you are probably familiar with the Klan. The Klan, though, was not just anti-black. The Klan was also anti-foreigner, anti-Catholic, anti-Jew, and anti-uppity women. In other words, the uppity women that were determined to keep women in their place, that women should stay at home, bear the children, tend to the household chores, and be subservient, and not exert themselves by trying to get the right to vote and getting jobs outside the home. They were against this. Again, these ideas are nothing new. A lot of this sounds like the American Party of the 1850s that ran Millard Fillmore for president. Again, anti-Jew, anti-Catholic, anti-immigrant, as well as anti-black. The Ku Klux Klan was a Protestant organization. Make a long story short, very Christian. I mean, it may sound like what they believed was unchristian, but they claimed to be extremely Christian, as long as it was Protestant Christianity. Now, folk, I mean, I'm just stating the facts here. Now, if you disagree with the facts, you're welcome to tell me now if I'm wrong. Now, again, folk, what I want to do about racism, and it's awful, it's ugly. I wish we could just put it behind us as something that we once did. Yes, we don't want to sweep it, we don't want to forget we once did it, but hopefully we'll stop it right here. Leave all bigotry behind us. But we don't do it by acting like it didn't happen. Okay, it did happen, yes. But after 150 years, that's how long it's been since the Civil War ended, a little bit longer than that. or after more than 50 years since we started trying to end racism in the South, more than 50 years since the Civil Rights Act was passed, it might be time, it is time we began to put it behind us and move forward. But again, I don't want to, I mean, you've all heard about the Klan. It was very important, so yes, I must mention it. My wife found out, to her somewhat chagrin, that her mother's father was a secret member of the Klan at one point. A lot of young whites found the Klan attractive. Now, the Klan asserted itself strong in the 1860s, 1870s. Then it died out for a while. In the 1920s, it was to reassert itself until the Klan Grand Vizier was caught having sex with an underage girl. And in those days, that would destroy not just the person, but the group that he was with. So the Klan went downhill for a while during the 30s. Well, in the 30s, we had to fight a depression. In the 40s, we fought a war. But in the 50s, the race issue came back, and in the 60s, the Klan came on strong again. And a lot of the people I went to school with were pro-Klan. And I worked at Lockheed with a man who insisted that the Klan was lied about, that it was not racist, and it was not anything that we've heard it was. If any of you feel the same way, your views are welcome. But he talked to me at some length. He was sitting on a bicycle trying to tell me how wonderful the Klan actually was. Again, anybody? All right, if not, we'll move on. It was there, folk, and it favored all the stuff that I'm talking about. The Congress decided that they were going to assert themselves, so they sent troops into the South, more troops, in order to enforce federal laws. All this did was stir up the Southern people even harder and make the Southern people more resistant. Again, when the 15th Amendment was passed, they thought this will settle the issue, law or no law. The Southern people just became more stirred up. They found ways to circumvent the law. And like I say, the Supreme Court, this is one time when the court actually overruled a law, overruled the Constitution, the plain meaning of the Constitution. Again, taking on power that they should not have had and should not have been allowed to have. All right. Anyway, federal troops are put into the South. Now keep this in mind because this is going to become important later. It's called the Military Reconstruction Act. Well, the Military Reconstruction Act was supposed to force the South to give the black man the vote. As we pretty well know, it didn't. All right. Now we come to the subject of impeachment. All right, I've got to make something clear that's often misunderstood. To impeach does not mean you turn a president or a government official out of office. To impeach merely means you bring the charges. Now, in every state, every state can bring charges against its governor or against the court members. You can turn a judge out of office, but the House of Representatives brings the charges. They can bring the charge by a simple vote, plus one vote. I mean, one vote majority. It's got to be one vote majority. They can bring charges. There have only been 2 presidents who were impeached. None were removed from office. The 2 presidents who were impeached were Andrew Johnson and Bill Clinton. But in both cases, when it went to the Senate, the House comes in and brings a charge by majority plus one vote. One vote majority, and the House can bring a charge. But the Senate have to have 2/3 of the Senate to approve of it before a president is turned out of office. Bill Clinton was impeached, and you might ask, what about Richard Nixon? In Richard Nixon's case, when he finally released some tapes that showed that he had covered up from day 3 after the Watergate break-in, he had no support left. As long as he had 33 senators who he believed would vote with him, he stayed in office. Never mind the House was going to vote to impeach him, but the House never did. Instead, because the House knew they didn't have the 67 senators who'd vote. But after he released those last tapes, he only had about 10 or 15 senators left who'd vote with him. And at that point, rather than make the country go through the impeachment process, he resigned. So Nixon resigned. He did not. He was never impeached. But anyway, Johnson was impeached, Bill Clinton, but neither one of them were turned out of office. Now, the crime. A president can only be impeached for high crimes and misdemeanors. So keep this in mind, I mean, because there's been talk of impeaching our president also. You hear a lot of impeachment talk. Right here was the crime. Congress passed a law over Johnson's veto that took away from President Johnson his power to dismiss men who work for the executive. Now, a president cannot fire a senator. The president cannot fire a congressman. The president cannot fire a judge. But the president can fire men who work within the executive department. Well, they took from Mr. Johnson the right that is available to every president. Mr. Johnson could not turn out of office anyone in the executive branch, but he did not specify cabinet members. Well, Johnson read the law and he said, well, he knew of a cabinet member who was telling the Congress everything that went on in his cabinet meetings. Basically, if this man was supposed to be loyal to Johnson. Well, a president has a right to fire a cabinet member. And again, our present president fires people right and left. All right, I mean, I know, I'm jumping around, but again, all right. Each of you can decide yourself whether they deserve it or not. But anyway, this man was telling the Congress everything that went on in the cabinet meeting, and Johnson fired him. But again, the law that they passed, they called the Tenure of Office Act, did not specify that the president could not fire a cabinet member. But Johnson fired a cabinet member. The Congress rose up and brought charges of high crimes and misdemeanors against Johnson for the firing of this cabinet member. Well, Johnson got a couple of wise attorneys who said to him, listen, Mr. Johnson, we think we can defend you, but you keep your mouth shut. Basically, they were hinting that you yourself are your own worst enemy with your harsh speech and your harsh criticism. You keep quiet. Johnson took the advice and did that. And our present president, I think, has finally caught on. Sometimes you're better off if you keep your trap shut. Anyway, Johnson kept himself quiet while his lawyers defended him. In those days, they had this act of strike. There was no vice president. The 25th Amendment had not been passed, so Johnson had been a vice president who took over. But in those days, the new president did not appoint a vice president. So there was no vice president. What this meant was the president pro tem of the Senate would take office as president if Johnson were removed from office. Well, the president pro tem promised, I will keep an open mind and give him a fair hearing, knowing full well that he was going to be the next president. He voted to impeach. It was a tough league, folk, in those days. Yeah, he voted to impeach. But later, John Kennedy, who later became president, wrote a book, Profiles in Courage, which he described one of 8 senators committed political suicide by voting with John. But one of them was a man named Mr. Ross. And everybody told Mr. Ross, you've got to vote to out of office. You've got to. Ross would never commit himself. When it came time to vote, they called out the name of the president pro tem of the Senate. Mr. Ross. And the person said, he said guilty, guilty. So then Mr. Ross shouted out, not guilty. To make sure they could hear him. Ross was criticized severely and called names that I would not repeat here. Nevertheless, the vote to impeach failed by 1 vote. His vote, along with 8 other Republican senators who more. But a few years, Johnson was removed from office, but a few years later, Johnson came back to the Senate. And all those senators almost thought who had voted to impeach him were gone by that time. Now, you might ask, how did Johnson get to be president, being a Southerner? Johnson was actually a Southern Democrat. The reason was there was no popular vote, so Johnson was chosen by the convention. The Republican Party, for this one time, changed its name to Union Party, and they bypassed Lincoln's first vice president, Hannibal Hamlin, who had been loyal to Lincoln, been loyal to the Union, been a good man, might have made a good president, but they bypassed him and put Johnson in to make the South happy. When all the senators left the Senate in 1861, when all the Southern senators left in 1861, Johnson stayed there. So Johnson was allowed to keep his seat in the Senate. He voted, even though his state had left the Union, but he was from Tennessee. But he was allowed to stay in the Senate, and he was treated with equal respect to the other senator. He voted like he was supposed to, like a senator would, even though his state was out of the Union. And then they made him vice president to make the South happy. So basically, he was a man with a lot of Southern sympathies, and he wanted to be soft on the South as to where he stood on race. You know, by 2019 standards, folk, he was a racist. But then again, by 2019 standards, so was Abraham Lincoln a racist. And folk, you have to judge these people according to their time period that they lived. You can't judge them by 2019 standards. I mean, if you do, you're going to, well, I mean, what you're going to find out is that every human being who has ever lived has had some serious fault and flaw.